Welcome back to Swordbox. We're on day 18 of 66 books in 66 days. And today we come to the book of Job. You know, Job is believed to be one of the oldest books of the Bible. The title Job is the name of the central character of the book. The author is not identified, and yet Job is referred to in the New Testament, identifying him as a real person who lived in the time of the patriarchs. The book of Job pulls back the curtains of heaven and allows us a brief look into the unseen spiritual realm. We get to look into a conversation between Satan and God and see the explanation for a series of trials and sufferings in the life of Job that remain hidden to Job and his friends. We see here that as limited creations, we can't always know the cause of things, the reasons for certain trials and sufferings, and we must keep in mind that the secret things indeed do belong to our God. You know, many sermons and books have been written on the subject of why bad things happen to good people. Yet as we clearly see in the case of Job, we may never know the reasons for many of them on this side of heaven. A very difficult pill to swallow when you are the one, or someone you love is the one who is suffering and hurting. You know, anytime we experience pain and suffering and trials, we as humans want to know why. What's behind this? And as Christians, knowing that God is in control, knowing that God is sovereign and that God is all-powerful, if He didn't cause it, well then we know He certainly allowed it to happen. If we develop an attitude and a mindset that says, I won't accept unfair, unjust, and unexplained suffering, and just trust God regardless, we will become shipwrecked in our Christian voyage when the bad storms come and we can't figure out all the whys. It doesn't mean that we won't ever have doubts or ask why or struggle with it. Of course we will. But ultimately, as we have settled it at the time of salvation, we belong to Christ and we are not our own. Therefore, what happens to us in this life is up to Him. The psalmist wrote, my times are in your hands. The kind of attitude we need to have. Well, the book of Job begins with the description of the man Job. It says that he was a blameless and an upright man, one who feared God and shunned evil. This man was living right. He was walking in obedience to God. He took spiritual initiative and responsibility for his family. I mean, Job was a model Christian. Well, then we're taken away from this earthly realm and find ourselves in heaven where God's angels are, I suppose, reporting to Him, and among them is Satan. After answering God's questions to where Satan had come from, God initiated a conversation about Job, and it's evident that Satan knows who Job is. And I just want to say, if you're following Christ and making an impact, Satan knows who you are as well. Now God reaffirms the blamelessness and the godliness of Job to Satan, who in turn challenges Job's ability to remain that way if God removed His hand of protection, which was obviously there in Job's life, which should give us some comfort, knowing that God really does set up hedge of protections around His people. Well, there's so much going on here, but just not enough time to really speak to all of it. But my point I want us to get today is that we have to decide, come what may, that we will still remain faithful to the Lord and not become bitter or give up when life isn't fair or doesn't make sense. So through a series of meetings with God and Satan, the devil received permission from God to bring horrible, undeserved tragedies and sufferings into the life of Job. His cattle, his servants, his home, his children, and finally his health are all touched. Job basically lost everything without any explanation. Job's response? He fell to the ground and he worshiped God. And in the last verse of chapter 1, verse 22, the Bible says, in all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. Man, that's a hard thing to do. I wish I could say that I always did that when bad things happened to me, but I must confess there were times where I certainly was mad and angry at God and blamed Him for allowing certain things to happen. Well, Job's wife and Job's 3 friends, instead of giving him comfort, sought to find fault in Job, and his wife even told him to simply curse God and die. You know, Job's heart was the kind of heart we all need to have. He said in Job chapter 1, verse 21, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in verse 2:10, in chapter 2:10, he said, shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? You know, you got to remember, Job had no idea why all these things just happened. He just lost all of his children. I think he had 10 kids. All of them were killed. his cattle ruined, his house caved in, and now he's sitting in the desert with boils from head to toe in excruciating pain. And he yet never got mad at God. He never blamed God. You know, many of us have a problem with a good God allowing or causing suffering in our lives. We can't understand, and we want an explanation that satisfies our sense of justice and fairness, cause and effect, and understanding. Real briefly, I want us to look real quick at some of the sources of our suffering. And maybe if you're going through something today, maybe you can understand why you're going through it. But there may be times when you simply don't. Number one, we can suffer because of other people. People sin, and sin affects people. We have, as do others, the ability to hurt people with our words or with our action. And we can bring pain and suffering to them, or they can bring pain and suffering to us. So number one, we need to remember that people can cause our sufferings. Jesus' command to us is to love our neighbor as ourselves. It's not what he wants for us to hurt each other, but to love one another. Number two, we can do it ourselves. Much of our suffering in this life is a result of our own choices. Often we ignore God's warnings and do our own thing only to question God when things fall apart. Thirdly, from Satan. Just like with Job, his goal is always to kill, to steal, and destroy. And fourthly, it could come from God. God could be performing discipline in our lives, judgment, or simply allowing adversity and pain and trials for our own growth. And you know, there's a fourth aspect here. The secret things indeed belong to God. We simply are not going to know or understand all of God's reasons for bringing some hard things in our lives. But you know what? Even though we can't always identify the source behind our suffering, and even though our friends may try to help and only make things worse, it really boils down to this. Do you trust God no matter what? Job did. I want to be more like Job, and I'm sure I'll go through a lot more trials and more sufferings in this life, and hopefully I'll get it right. But it really does boil down to, do you trust God? Even though it hurts, even though it's painful, even though you don't understand it, do you trust Him? Not just when things are going great. It's easy to trust God and think, oh wow, He's good. What about when everything falls apart? Do you still trust Him? Do you still believe Him? And are you still going to follow Him? That's my prayer for you. God bless you. We'll see you back here tomorrow.